Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2. I am honored to be your MC for today and to be introducing our panel, Segregation and Desegregation in the 20th Century, Lessons for Today's Effort. In the consideration of time, I will be providing brief introduction for our speakers and in consideration of time, I will be providing brief introduction for our speakers. Our first speaker is Ms. Lisa Rice, the President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, where she has helped to expand housing opportunities for millions of Americans in the country. Our second speaker is Dr. Andre Terry, who is a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in the Metropolitan Policy Program. His recent book is Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. Our third speaker is Professor Michelle Adams, a professor at Cardozo School Law in New York City, focusing on fair housing law and race discrimination. Her forthcoming book is The Containment: Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for Racial Justice. And our moderator for today is Miguel Solis. Miguel was elected to Dallas Independent School Board's district and has served the residents of Dallas for 10 years, particularly in regards to education. We are honored to have our speakers here, and we thank you for your time and expertise. I will now pass it to Miguel, who will lead this conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And let me also thank our distinguished panelists for the opportunity to chat with you all. I got to tell you, I'm honored. I'm also kind of starstruck having followed all of your work. So I'll try my best to make sure that we have a lively and thoughtful discussion for our practitioners who are watching. Let me set the conversation up this way, because it's titled Segregation and Desegregation in the 20th Century, Lessons for Today, but it's not the 21st century, it's the 20th century. And as I was prepping for this panel, I was actually doing it on Monday and Tuesday. And it was on Tuesday that I realized I was prepping for this panel on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And growing up, going to school, studying history, I gotta be honest, I never learned about Tulsa, nor did I learn about much of what we're going to talk about today. There was a quote that was mentioned yesterday from David McCullough, that history is a guide to navigation in perilous times. That made me think of another quote from James Baldwin, that not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so I really want to impress upon all of the participants that are watching today, I want to impress on them that this history is a history that, you know, many of us may know now, but that still drives a lot of the work that we're having to reverse today. And so as we engage in this conversation, we will be talking a lot about this history, but also helping us try to figure out where do we go in the future. So let me just jump right in. I want to go to you, Ms. Rice. Can you describe the forces that perpetuated housing segregation in the 20th century? And then if you can be specific, what are federal, state, or local policies that you might point to that exemplify these forces?
Miguel, thank you for the question. And this is really an important issue, because segregation is very much an orchestrated construct. It is not natural, but it's also one of the bedrocks of inequality. And before I delve into what happened in the 20th century, I must point out that in this space where we now occupy, we have more than a 500-year history of passing hundreds, if not thousands, of laws and ordinances. We've spent trillions, hundreds of trillions of dollars in creating a deeply inequitable society, in creating systems of injustice that we're still living with today. And segregation is just one of those structures of inequality. In fact, we're more segregated today than we were 100 years ago. And that is in large part due to the many forces that perpetuated segregation in the 20th century. And I must point out that it's not just the segregation of people by race that is damaging. It's coupling that with the segregation of resources. So, the question that you ask, we could be here literally all day responding to it because the forces are too numerous to name, but I will just tick off a few, Miguel. And in the private sector, during the 20th century, the National Association of Realtors, or its predecessor, because it changed its name, the National Association of Realtors encouraged segregation. In fact, the organization adopted a code of ethics that required real estate agents to promote segregation. Members could be expelled if they didn't comply. And as such, real estate professionals engaged in blockbusting. They engaged in racial steering to promote segregation. My parents were racially steered when they went to purchase their home, their first home. Real estate agents also promoted the use of racially restrictive covenants. There are some claims that racially restrictive covenants were in fact first developed and created by real estate practitioners. Financial institutions also contributed to segregation by engaging in redlining practices and other forms of discrimination. And so you had this construct where as more people of color would move into a community, banks would then move out. They would abandon and disinvest from those areas, turning those communities into credit deserts and helping to sort of lay the foundation for the dual credit market that is still with us today. Our federal government also played a role. The federal government required segregation in the housing developments and programs that they funded and supported. The most widely known example of this is the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was put in place during the Great Depression to save people from going into foreclosure. The Homeowners Loan Corporation established the nation's first amortizing loan product. So prior to the advent of HOLC, if you wanted to buy a home with a mortgage, you got a balloon loan. And so what the HOLC did was it developed this really affordable mortgage product. The idea was to refinance people out of balloon mortgages and put them into a sustainable mortgage. But the agency wanted to know where it should be targeting its resources, A, and B, how much it should charge people. So it hired real estate professionals to fan out across the country to complete what were called residential security surveys in order to rank and grade neighborhoods on a series of factors. And one of those factors was whether or not there were any Black people living in the neighborhood. In fact, at the very top of the survey, there was a fixed space designated quote unquote Negro. And so the surveyor was supposed to indicate yes or no if there were any Black people living in the neighborhood, and then what percentage of Black folks were living in the neighborhood. This is the only race that is specified on this residential security survey form. So they wanted to know. Definitely. I mean, the one thing that the federal government wanted to know was, are there any Black folks living in the neighborhood? Now, I have to say, Miguel, I have not looked at every single residential security survey, but I have looked at hundreds of them. And every single one that I have seen, if there were any Black people living in the area, 2% Black folks, 3% Black folks, it received the worst rating, which was a D grade, meaning that the area was hazardous. And on the accompanying maps, for which we now call redlining maps, these areas were colored red, hence the term redlining. The Federal Housing Administration adopted this redlining system that had been created by the HOLC. And in between the HOLC and the FHA, what we got, Miguel, was this association, the systemic association, the institutionalization of the association between race and risk. And that is a systemic problem that we're still dealing with today in our housing and financial services markets.
And I was going to say, Ms. Wright, as you mentioned, there were thousands of these types of decisions that were made, and thousands in the housing sector, let alone all of the other sectors that then led to sort of a compounding effect that Dr. Perry, you write about so beautifully in your book, and really in your book, you let us know you experienced this. This is an effect that you had to deal with. You specifically talk about the impact of systemic devaluation of Black communities and Black homes. What do you mean by this? And then if you could add to what Ms. Reich just built on, how did it come to be?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for hosting this important event on segregation. I've actually have been building off of our panelists' work for years. I was in the education sector, and so many times I used to hear this phrase: "If we could only fix education, everything will be all right." And ignoring housing, ignoring transportation, ignoring the factors that lead to reduced funding in schools, that lead to the kind of curricular choices that we make. So when I started looking at the conditions that impact housing, I started looking at home prices, because we know that much of the revenues that schools get are based upon how homes are assessed on their price. So one of the things we did initially was look at the overall value of homes and compared them places where the share of the Black population is 50% or higher, and compared them to homes where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. Now, and most people will know that homes in Black neighborhoods are lower, but they will say it's because of education, it's because of crime, but those are things you can control for, and that's what we did. And after we're controlling for all those factors, we found that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, there is a loss of $156 billion in equity. Now, that's the money municipalities use for infrastructure, for policing, for education, for all kinds of services. It's also the money people use to lift themselves up. It's 156 billion is the equivalent of 8 million four-year degrees based on the average amount of a four-year diploma. So when homes are systemically undervalued, it's robbing people of the opportunity to send their kids to college, to start businesses. It's robbing municipalities. It's a big deal. So if you are interested in education and you're not interested in segregation, that doesn't make any sense. It goes back into this mode of we can just fix Black people and everything will be all right. No, these things, we need a systemic approach to ed reform that includes the way we organize ourselves in communities. And there are multiple ways we can fund schooling that is not dependent upon where you live. Remember, we have other structures like in healthcare where they collect revenues and they distribute things equitably across regions. And so I'm going to leave it there. But the reason why I started looking at housing is because we're constantly trying to fix students and parents, and we never get at the root causes of the inequality. And so, and that's what I think this panel and this conference is about, is getting to root causes.
Thank you for that, Dr. Perry. As the 20th century sort of evolved, housing segregation, what was as pernicious a policy approach as any. But parallel to that, you also had education segregation. And to the lay person who took a basic American history course, many people think, well, that was solved in 1954 with Brown v. Board. Professor Adams, you're an expert on constitutional law, and you have a particular focus on school segregation and a particular expertise in another case that in many ways was as impactful as Brown versus Board of Education, and perhaps regressed some of the progressive impact that Brown versus Board was supposed to have, and that's Milliken versus Bradley. What was that case? Why was it important then, and why is it still important today?
Well, Miguel, thank you so much for this question, and I also want to thank my co-panelists. I'm delighted to be here, and one of the biggest reasons why is because this is a vitally important question for today. It's not just of historical interest, which I think both of my co-panelists have spoken towards, but how it impacts our world today. So let me go back, Miguel, for a second. You mentioned Brown. Let me talk about Brown for a second, then I want to get us into Milliken. So journey with me, if you will, and we're going to take a little bit of con law, but we're going to do it in a really fun way. So let's start with Brown. Everybody knows about Brown versus Board of Education, decided in 1954. The court says separate is inherently unequal, all right? And so, one might think, well, that ended the segregation in public schools. And so the question becomes, we look around today, we see that the schools are still segregated. And the question is, why? Was Brown ineffectual? Was it never enforced? The question is, what happened? And I think one answer to that question that many folks, although not the folks in this panel, but many folks who haven't focused on in terms of the answer to that is a case called Milliken versus Bradley, which was decided in 1974. And Milliken arose in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan. And it was really interesting because it was a situation where a northern school board controlled by relatively liberal school board members decided in 1970 to try to implement a relatively modest integration plan. Okay, and they do this. And as you might imagine, there was significant backlash to that integration plan. It was important, it was modest, but it was important because about half the high schools in Detroit were going to be desegregated under this plan. And for the first time in the history of the school district, whites were going to be required to go to Black schools and vice versa. So it created a tremendous amount of consternation in the community. And the reaction to that was that the state of Michigan, through its legislation, overturned by statute the limited integration plan that had been put into practice by the Detroit Board of Education. NAACP comes along and says, that sounds kind of, or it feels kind of like what they do in the South. They pass laws to prevent integration. I think we need to sue about this. And so the NAACP does ultimately sue, and they sue the state of Michigan. They actually sue the Board of Education because it had been involved in lots of segregation in the Detroit school system. They get involved, and they get lucky in a sense because they get a very conservative but open-minded trial judge in their case, a guy named Judge Roth, Stephen Roth, and he had an open mind. And what happened was the NAACP put on a magnificent 41-day trial. Okay, 10 days of which go to directly what Lisa was talking about. They had 10 days of a housing case. And in that 10 days of housing, they talked about the federal programs that Lisa was discussing. They talked about racially restrictive covenants. They talked about FHA programs that discriminated on the basis of race. They talked about separate broker associations, racially separate broker associations that were essentially mandated by the state of Michigan. They talked about white violence that occurred when Blacks tried to move into white neighborhoods. They talked about the police not protecting African Americans who were attempting to move into the housing and move into the neighborhood of their choice. So they put this all on state segregation, federal segregation, local government policy. They basically showed that housing segregation was government policy at every single level. The trial judge hears this. He decides in favor of the plaintiffs, and then he's got a problem. He says, the schools are segregated in Detroit. Well, what am I going to do about it? And at that point in the early 1970s, the Detroit school system was majority minority and climbing. It was majority African American. And so the district court judge says, if we want to have meaningful desegregation in the city of Detroit, we actually should reach into the suburbs and use some of the suburban school districts and have them involved in an inter-district desegregation plan. And so the trial judge orders the single largest massive inter-district desegregation plan in the history of the United States. Okay, this is upheld a couple of times by the Intermediate Court of Appeals, and we start putting it into practice in the city of Detroit and in the suburbs. And there's actually some interracial groups that form that attempt to try to facilitate this plan, although there's obviously a lot of backlash against it. And so the question becomes, well, we get to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturns Judge Roth's plan, right? And the question becomes, well, why does it matter? That's the Milliken versus Bradley case decided in 1974. What difference does it make? And I'll tell you a couple of reasons, and then I'll stop talking. One thing that happens when the Milliken case comes down is that the Supreme Court essentially rewrites history. And now we're talking about history and the importance of history. It suggested that the causes of northern school segregation were unknown and unknowable, okay? And in effect, the Supreme Court whitewashed history. The reasons for northern school segregation were known and knowable, and in fact, they were proved in the trial judge's courtroom. And all of this evidence came out in trial, as I mentioned: redlining, racial steering by realtors, racially separate real estate associations, racially restrictive covenants, discrimination in mortgage lending, discrimination in titling of property, discrimination in federal housing programs, a literal segregation wall that was less than 10 minutes from my house, and I never knew about it. That came in, right? All of that, but the Supreme Court says, you know what? We just don't know what happened. We don't understand why the schools look the way they look. And so one of the things that's so important about it is that all of that proof had come in, but the Supreme Court sort of suggests that the reason why the schools are segregated, it's natural, maybe it's accidental, maybe people just live where they live. And it provided a counter narrative to the actual historical record and what had actually happened, right? The fact that this segregation was government policy, right? And it's important when we think about what's going on today, the fight against critical race theory, the disputes that are happening in connection with the 1619 Project. All of that is about whose version of reality is true, right? And we're having an incredibly pitched battle about that now. So I invite you to imagine what might have happened if the Supreme Court in 1974 had acknowledged that history and it turned to the American public and said, you know what, this is what occurred, as opposed to trying to diffuse it, to provide a counter narrative, right? So that's one of the reasons why it's so important. The other reason why Milliken is so important is that most folks don't know this, but in the early 1970s, as a matter of law, it was the question about whether what we call de facto segregation, which is where you can't necessarily prove how the segregation came about, whether that would actually violate the Constitution. There was an open question at the beginning of the 1970s. And the Supreme Court is basically trying to figure out sort of what violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. President Nixon was deeply concerned about this. And one of the things that happens in Milliken is that the court sort of shuts the door on the idea that de facto segregation can violate the Constitution. And then finally, and then I'll stop talking, Milliken is also a hinge case, decided in 1974. Before 1974, in cases like Green and Swan, the Supreme Court was pretty committed to trying to desegregate the Southern schools. After 1974 and after Nixon's 4 appointees onto the Supreme Court, the court moves away from desegregating the Southern schools and puts up a roadblock in terms of desegregating the Northern schools. It's a moment in time and history that really matters, and it changes the world as we see it today. Milliken was a harbinger of things to come. I'll stop there, but that's how I would answer your question.
And I'll tell you, that is a history that many people don't know, and that decision still drives much of what we're talking about and much of the work that is happening with our participants in the conference. I want to come back though to Ms. Rice for a second, because in the mid 60s, it would be unfair for us to say that the federal government got everything wrong when it came to housing segregation. In the mid 60s, obviously we saw the Fair Housing Act come forward and have some impact on things like stopping redlining. What did the federal government get right in efforts to integrate in housing? And then what did they still get wrong post 60s?
Yeah, Miguel, that's a great question. And sadly, I have to say the federal government didn't get much right when it came to addressing housing discrimination and segregation. As you mentioned, the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, implemented at the end of 1968. It was passed 7 days after Dr. King's assassination. But the Fair Housing Act does contain this brilliant reparative provision called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. This provision mandates that any entity that is using federal funds for a housing or an urban development related purpose has to combat housing discrimination and work to address the harms caused by discrimination, and that includes segregation. And so in 1970, Secretary George Romney, who was a Nixon appointee, made many attempts to implement and enforce that affirmatively furthering fair housing provision. And that included, Miguel, withholding funds from jurisdictions, including jurisdictions in his home state, the state that he previously was governor of, Michigan. Withholding funds from jurisdictions that were promoting segregation. The mayors and elected officials of these cities where he was withholding funds from immediately started complaining to President Nixon. George Romney and Nixon got into a little battle over this fair housing issue. And of course, Nixon dismissed George Romney. Unfortunately, little was done since Romney's departure to enforce the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision. That's one of the reasons we haven't made a lot of progress. And that lack of progress is really manifest in the racial wealth and homeownership gaps that we're seeing today. It's manifest in the appraisal gap that Andre was talking about. But 45 years after Secretary Romney's gallant efforts, the Obama administration finally, after decades of prodding by civil rights leaders, issued an AFFH rule. That rule, unfortunately, was issued toward the end of President Obama's term, but it did set out very clear standards for jurisdictions to comply with the law and to engage in efforts to address segregation and the harms of segregation. The Trump administration, unfortunately, quickly upended that rule, but now the Biden administration is, we're seeing overturning the Trump administration's really horrible rule that stopped the implementation of the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate. In fact, right after Biden's inauguration, he issued a fair housing memorandum, which instructed HUD to enforce the provision. And so HUD has drafted a new AFFH rule. It is being reviewed now by the Congress, and it should be open for comment within the coming weeks. So it is my hope, Miguel, that we will finally get to a place where we are seeing the federal government fully enforcing the AFFH mandate, because it has never, ever been really enforced, even though the Fair Housing Act is over 50 years old.
Dr. Perry, I want to turn to you again, and I had a question teed up, but I want to maybe ask it a little differently. As a lot of the history that we've been discussing on this panel has come to light for a lot more people in our country, there's been another concept that's been bubbling up. And when I read your book, I think about this concept a little more, and that's the concept of restitution and reparation. You think about the consequences of all of these stacked up decisions, then generating the racial wealth gap that we know today and intergenerational poverty. I'd like to get your thoughts on how we might move forward in trying to reverse what this has caused, specifically from a wealth standpoint.
Well, I've been talking about this all week since Biden issued his fact sheet on his efforts to close the racial wealth divide. And he looks at equity in a very specific way. He looks at equity in terms of fairness under the law. A lot of what the federal government is doing now, and I applaud these efforts, are really trying to bring fairness under the law. But even if you remove all the drags of racism from policy, if you can do that, and if we did, you would still have a wealth gap that's unbelievable. I mean, that this the wealth gap of I'll use 2016 numbers. It's a little different now, but 2016 numbers was 170,000 of white median wealth compared to 17,000 of Black median wealth. And so even if we removed all the racism, you know, there is no catching up. There's no closing that gap without some form of stimulus. Now, I debate this issue of reparations all the time, and people say that Americans don't believe in reparations. I don't agree with that. When just after a few weeks of being socially distanced, the business community said the federal government must repair us. They must give us, they must fill the gap. You know, we certainly have seen Native Americans, Japanese, who were interned, receive reparations. Certainly international. We've been down this road before. We know how to do it. It's just when it comes to reparations for Black people, then it becomes a problem. So so for me, we believe in reparations. We do it on occasion. But when it comes to Black people, we've been demanding it since Reconstruction. But this isn't, people act like this call for reparations is new. It's actually since 40 Acres and a Mule. Before that, people were demanding reparations. But I do think it is a necessary tool if we want to close the racial wealth gap. Now, I also think that reparations should come in other forms. There are different claims for reparations. That's
exactly what I was trying to tee you up to as well. Yeah. To say, we always think about that from a wealth standpoint, and rightly so, but what other equitable ways, specifically in the areas of maybe housing and education, might we take that lens to a policy approach?
Yeah, and I was going to say, so when a lot of people think of reparations, they certainly think of slavery, and there's that claim. But then there's reparations for housing discrimination, the redlining, the real estate agent behavior, the lending. And just as, I mean, we forget this, but the New Deal actually showed us a path towards building wealth. If we give people low interest loans, grants in the form of reparations, so that people can either start new communities, refinance their home, build, you can actually create a new era of wealth building in this country. So we've actually done this before. We've figured out a way to give subsidies to low wealth people, just not Black people. Again, this is not like people say, how will you do this? The same way we empowered and built wealth for white Americans in this country, the same exact way. So if you're talking business loans, you're talking down payment assistance, refinancing assistance, we've done this before. We just haven't done it for Black people. And that's if there's a controversy, that's what it is, but there's no controversy. We know how to do this.
I want to come back, Professor Adams, to you now to say that as we're getting towards wrapping up, Milliken versus Bradley occurred at the height of urban flight to the suburbs. Today's phenomena see people coming back to the urban core. And with that, an interesting set of circumstances in which you've got public schools that in many cases are under-enrolled and potential placing of students back into these schools who may have not chosen these schools in the past. So how might this new pattern present an opportunity for segregated schools and urban cores to integrate? And what conditions do you think are necessary for that to occur?
Miguel, thank you for the question. But before I answer it, I have to just add one additional thing to Andre's point, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And the idea that we know how to do this, we also know how to do it overseas. You think about the Marshall Plan. Right after World War II, I mean, we spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars reconstructing bombed out Europe. because we knew it was in our best interest to do so, and it was the right thing to do. And so we do have a historical precedence to draw on to be able to think about ways to reconstruct our communities. So Andre, thank you for that. Miguel, on your question, I think the key word is opportunity. I think that white folks moving back to the cities, and of course we're going to sort of put aside sort of what's happened since COVID, right? Because we're still kind of trying to figure out what's the story there. But certainly pre-COVID, we saw many more folks coming back into the cities than we had seen, obviously, in the 1970s, and it creates the preconditions for potential integration. And I think that's a really positive thing. I took a look at, in connection with thinking about the panel today, Gary Orfield is sort of the gold standard when it comes to school desegregation and housing, released a report in March of 2019 where he looked at New York City. It was called the New York City School Integration, New York City School Integration and Gentrifying Neighborhoods, Evidence from New York City. And what he found was between 2000 and 2015, the shares of what he called intensely segregated and hyper-segregated elementary schools declined in gentrifying areas of New York City, while the shares of intensely segregated and hyper-segregated elementary schools increased in non-gentrifying areas. So there's an opportunity there, but I think that there are certain preconditions that have to be met. And I think that the three I would just touch on would be, number one, you're going to have look at zoning changes, right? If you look at how your schools are zoned, if they're zoned in a way that's drawn very narrowly around neighborhoods where you've got a very high percentage of one population, then your schools are going to reflect that. So you want to take a look at your zoning and potentially rezone to be able to pull in folks from diverse backgrounds. Number two, you want to, I think, look at magnet programs, which have been quite successful. There's actually a federal statute around magnet programs, magnet schools. And that federal statute, we haven't actually had enough money pouring into the cities and states to be able to create magnet programs, which can then create an incentive for folks from different backgrounds to go to the same schools. Magnet programs have been successful when they've been funded appropriately. And then I think on the housing side, you've got to preserve affordable housing, because if you have people move into a particular area and they can no longer afford to rent and they can't afford to buy, then what you're having is just a sort of ships passing in the night. For instance, you could require that if developers want to build, that they actually have to contribute some amount of money into an affordable housing program, or require them to actually include affordable housing units in new developments. And so those are just three things that come to mind. But you've got to be intentional about this. It's not going to happen on its own. But if you're intentional about it, it creates the opportunity for desegregation, which I think is important.
There's obviously a lot more that I just personally wanted to ask you to get to know more about, but I certainly know that the conference participants could take value from as well. And so given that we are going to need to wrap up now, what I would offer to those watching is to go look at the work of Ms. Rice, to go read the book of Dr. Perry, to read the soon-to-be book of Professor Adams and the work they do, because in just preparing for this conversation, I can't tell you how much I learned within this one week. So let me personally just say thank you to each of you, not only for joining us today, but for the work that you have been doing to allow our practitioners in key insights to then make significant change. I want to note that the stream is going to continue as soon as this panel discussion wraps up. So we're going to mute all the mics in this room at that time. Again, thank you all for joining us. Good luck to our practitioners as you continue to make change. You are certainly leading the way, and you're delivering on Baldwin's quote. You are facing the issues today, and the change you make is going to write a new history for this nation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.